All right, today we are in Chapter 2, Section 2, and what we're going to talk about is farming in the plains. The Great Plains is a vast region we talked about earlier when we started the introduction to the chapter of prairie. It's throughout the west of the Mississippi River and east of the Rocky Mountains in the United States and in Canada. Although the population of the Great Plains was growing steadily after the Civil War, settlers faced many challenges. Summer temperatures could get as high as 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Prairie fires destroyed with frequent danger. Sometimes swarms of grasshoppers destroyed crops. And also, extremely in a different direction, the winters were extremely cold, which we talked about in the last section. So when we look at the beginning of the settlement, the first thing is the Great Plains region begins at the center of the Dakotas and extends through western Texas and continues all the way to the Rocky Mountains, which we've talked about that before with the geography. The wheat belt begins in the eastern edge of the Great Plains, including much of the Dakotas, Kansas, and Nebraska. And railroads made it easier to get to the west, while the promise of cheap farmland lured people to resettle. And the Homestead Act of 1862 established for a process people to claim federal lands in the west for a very small fee. So to think about this, we have what we call push-pull factors. What's going to happen is things are going to push people to move to the west, but they're also going to pull people to the west. Push factors would be things, the reasons why we had to leave somewhere else to go to the west. Some of those examples are crowding back east, displaced farmers, the former slaves that we've talked about before. Eastern farmland was expensive, and ethnic and religious repression in Europe. So it all gave people the want or the will to move to a harsher climate in an area where things might be difficult. There was also a lot of pull-in, meaning that things that were going to pull people away from their homes to come and settle in the West. There were government incentives, which we talked about before, the Pacific Railroad Act, the Morris Land Grant Act, and the Homestead Act, which we'll talk about today. There was also a lot of private property for miners, ranchers, and farmers, which meant that there was a lot of money to be made, even though it was going to be a challenging way. So the first act we'll talk about is the Pacific Railway Act, and it's in 1862 and 1864. And here, large land grants to Union Pacific Railroad and Central Pacific Railroad, over 175 million acres. And what this did is it gave us the opportunity to be able to cross the land and create an infrastructure to move products back to the east where the population centers were, but also then from the factories in the east to the new population centers that we were creating in the west. Here's an example of land. This is the Missouri Free Land, 500,000 acres of the best prairie timber and coal lands. Land is sold 40-acre lots for $10. Again, to show you the opportunities that were out there. And if you own nothing, the thought of owning property, which we talked about for slaves, but also for the impoverished people of the East, this is going to be a great opportunity. So the Morrill Land Grant Act of 1862, and each state government is going to receive 30,000 acres of federal land that they can either sell or create land grants, colleges for agricultural or mechanical arts. If the state doesn't have enough land to give out, the state was given a script that allowed them to take other land from other states. So this was a good opportunity for states to try to create wealth, create prosperity, and encourage investment into our future. The Homestead Act of 1862, for a small fee, settlers received 160 acres if they were 21 years of age. They built a house, and it lived there for at least 6 months of the year. The farm and the land for 5 years in a row. Through this act, there was 372,000 farms and 80 million acres. One thing that's important is Congress tried several times to pass this homestead legislation. Each time the legislation was defeated by the concerns of slavery prior to the Civil War. As Western territories applied for statehood, maintaining that balance of slave and non-slave states became increasingly important. The Homestead Act of 1862 was passed and signed by Abraham Lincoln. Homesteaders were required to improve their land by building and dwelling, and of course putting the crops on it. So if you said you were going to use it and you were going to build on it and you were going to live, you had the opportunity to do this. Exodus. These people are freemen who looked for a new start after the Civil War. Most headed to Kansas, and they were pulled by the Homestead Act and free land, meaning that this was the only opportunity that they were going to have to create or have their own land. Exodus based on the Bible, the Exodus of Hebrews from Egypt, leaving bondage for freedom in the Promised Land. So for African Americans, former slaves that were freed, this is going to be a good opportunity for them to have new land. Here's some images. I found a lot of cool stuff online. First-hand pictures, primary source images to show you what the land looked like and the dwellings that we had there. Homesteader homes. They were built with available material, and the available material was sod. They were small, and it was functional as a shelter. We're going to do a little bit of an activity called the Sod House Detectives, and we're going to look at how these things were made, and really were they safe. A lot of great imagery that I found to show you what these houses would look like. Because there was not a lot of trees, they had to build them low to the ground to stop from wind. But in reality, you could see a lot of the different aspects of how the sod was pounded or layered, and families would be able to live in these conditions. Obviously, it's not going to stop a windstorm or grasshoppers, but for the most part, the shelter gave them the heat or the sun, the cool that they need during the harsh winters and harsh summers. So the homesteader's lifestyle was very difficult. Subsistence farming was important, meaning that they had to do what they needed to do to survive. There was little to some livestock in the areas because, again, the people who were coming out here, they had to make a large travel. A lot of them didn't have money beforehand. So this was kind of their first way to invest in a new property, a new lifestyle. Of course, there was a lot of storms. There's a far distance between different places to go and get supplies. And there was also a lack of building materials. As we looked at some of those images that we said before, you could see there's not a lot of trees prevalent in a lot of this image because of the way the land looks. It is so flat in that way. But what we're going to see is there's going to be a lot of technology. And the question would be is, what methods of technological revolution in the agriculture made it practical to cultivate the plains. So some of this new technology made it easier for farms to farm large plots of land. For instance, John Deere still plow broke through the hard sod to turn up the fertile soil that was underneath. Seed drills were made possible to plant seeds in the deep soil where it was moist enough for them to sprout. The mechanical reaper and the binder could do the work of many men, and threshing machines automated the process of knocking kernels loose from stalks. So we have a lot of different technology that's going to become prevalent in this place, and it's going to lead to a lot of people becoming extremely wealthy. During the 1880s, many farmers in the states of the Northwest Territory moved to the Great Plains to take advantage of the inexpensive land and, of course, these new technologies. The wheat belt began the eastern edge of the Great Plains and covered much of the Dakotas, like we said before. New machines allowed families to bring substantial harvests on wheat farms of several hundred acres. Some wheat farmers cover up to 65,000 acres, and these things are going to be called bonanza farms. And they yielded such big profits. So just like the other mine owners that we've talked before, like talking about the gold rush, bonanza farmers formed companies. They invested in property and equipment and hired laborers as needed. So you created different jobs, and it also is going to create the wealth that's needed. So we're going to start to think about this. Everybody's getting this land. What you're going to see is the last part of the frontier is going to be known as the Oklahoma Land Rush. The census, thousands of people are going to race to claim the territory, even though they don't know. This is a picture to show you people who are literally just coming up to try to claim their land. Little did they know that a lot of the land was already claimed beforehand, people who snuck in without the permission. In reality, there was still a lot of unoccupied land still. The Homestead Act continued to encourage new settlement in the 1900s, but the closing of the frontier marked an end of the era. It worried many people that believed the frontier had provided a safety valve for social discontent, meaning people had the ability to leave their land because they wanted to have a different opportunity. So most settlers did indeed make a fresh start, adapting to the difficult environment of the plains. Water in their deep enabled them to plant trees and gardens and eventually create their own infrastructure. Railroads are going to start to bring lumber and bricks to replace the sod as building material, coal for fuel, and manufacture goods from the east, such as clothing and household goods. Small-scale farmers rarely become wealthy, but they could be self-sufficient. Typical homesteader raised cattle, chicken, and a few crops. The real story, though, of the West was about ordinary people who settled down and built homes and communities through great effort.